So the FAIR Act has been described by yourself and Representative Jamie Raskin as legislation that, quote, raises the level of proof necessary for the federal government to seize property, reforms the IRS structuring statute to protect innocent small business owners, and increases transparency and congressional oversight. So let's break it down. Let's start at the top. How would it specifically raise the proof required for the federal government to seize property?
Well, number one, it prevents the evasion of state forfeiture laws. It ensures forfeiture victims fair access to the courts with representation paid for if necessary. It places the proper burden of proof on the government. That's where it ought to be anyway. It protects innocent owners of property from forfeiture. For instance, if a prostitution ring or a drug ring is on the property, clearly unknown to the owner of the property, and is functioning out of there, even from a third party that comes on and uses it occasionally, you can't just take the property. And it sends federal forfeiture funds to the U.S. Treasury, keeping it out of the hands of individual law enforcement agencies, or federal agencies as well, and gives a certainty that the individual citizen or property owner will ultimately be able to get their resources back in a expedited fashion.
So the law enforcement agencies themselves would no longer benefit from civil asset forfeiture?
Correct.
Okay, and so what would be the reforms now for the IRS structuring statute to benefit small business owners?
Again, it's a complicated formula that will go into effect, but it makes it very clear again that as you structure it, it goes first and foremost to the property owner, and then ultimately, if there is adjudication that there was some wrongdoing, then it goes to the appropriate authorities that would benefit from it for the services that they rendered to get to the bottom of the civil infraction.
And what about the congressional oversight component? What is your legislation doing specifically to increase transparency?
Well, I think we also have, as always, we have the opportunity to bring the law enforcement entities in front of us to do oversight. And that's really the only way that Congress does continue the oversight function. We have the ability to bring them in front through subpoena or otherwise for any reason that we deem necessary to make sure, for instance, that the FBI hasn't reverted back to making false claims to a judge or incomplete claims to a judge in order to get the search warrant to do what they plan on doing. And it's not much more complicated than what goes on now, but it's put in the law to make sure that civil asset forfeiture has the same protections that criminal asset forfeiture has as well.
And Congressman, you've said before that it's too easy for the government to seize a private citizen's property. You even agreed now that at its face, civil asset forfeiture laws are guilty before proven innocent. So how did it get this way?
I think it just morphed into it. Patriot Act and other things that had good intended purposes initially to make sure that we got against illegal activities, drug running, money laundering that came from organized crime, et cetera. We had the ability to go after them. And certainly criminal asset forfeiture, when a person is actually adjudicated in a criminal code offense, I don't think there's anybody in society that wants a legal framework to function and crime to be taken off the streets, mind that a criminal loses their assets. But when you have an individual citizen in a civil case who hasn't even been given due process, that's a concern. And I think it developed over time as law enforcement agencies saw another means by which they could use this as they went after money laundering and drug running. They could use the assets to help them further resource them with drug teams, with crime prevention teams, with syndicate efforts, that here are some assets that we could use in purchasing electronic equipment and purchasing transportation tools, all sorts of things. But then it went beyond that, and we even saw some agencies, local agencies, buying publicity equipment, using assets. A Corvette Stingray that was seized and forfeited. Now I can put it in the local parade and paint it up like a law enforcement vehicle. All of the crazy stuff that began to take place just because the money was there. And I don't think the majority of law enforcement agents themselves and police officers thought of it that way, but it was because it was allowed. And then we began to start hearing these tragic stories of innocent people being caught in the trap of something that was never intended for them. And then the stories of how difficult it was for them to get their resources back. And I think myself, Jamie Raskin, and others, in hearing from constituents, these stories began to say enough's enough. This is not what law enforcement is to be about.
And you mentioned Congressman Jamie Raskin again. Obviously, this is a bipartisan bill, and 2 additional Democrats, 2 additional Republicans also co-sponsored it as well. So why do you think there is such bipartisan support when it comes to this issue, when it comes to your legislation?
Well, I think it simply comes to civil liberties. Conservatives and progressives and everyone in between believe that one of the uniqueness of our country is that we are innocent until proven guilty. We all deserve due process under the law. And if that breaks down, then we have no certainty about how any of us will be treated. And I think that's where we come together. We may come around the circle from a different perspective to start, but in the end, we come back to individual liberties that must be protected. And I think that's why Representative Raskin and I, from the 2, I think, ends of the spectrum, can come together on something as important as this. And I appreciate the fact that he, being a noted law professor and attorney, as well as a progressive, can join with a conservative like me. And hopefully this time can get this done.
And in the spirit of bipartisanship, are there any other policy areas aside from this one that you can see in this term working with Democrats on?
Well, I'm sure there are. We saw last week on the issue of TikTok. As I said, on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and the chair and the ranking member and colleagues on both sides of the aisle took a very strong stance against what TikTok was doing and their very clear connections to the Chinese Communist Party. I think that's there. In the area of veterans issues and senior issues, there's plenty of space where we can come across. I'm hoping that there's areas on energy that we can come together on in dealing with climate issues as well as just the general public. So there are a lot of things that I think we can look at. We've seen to a great degree on the issue of Ukraine, bipartisanship, even though the news media, the national media is now talking about Republicans dragging their feet a bit. It's not so much dragging their feet as saying, listen, we just want transparency. But I think the key issue of making sure that Putin doesn't come out the winner in aggressing against a sovereign nation, those are items that I think are in too few cases talked about as bipartisan agreements that may not be 100%, but could get 80, 90% agreement, and we can move it. At least in the House, I can say that.
Congressman, that's interesting when you list those areas that you can see yourself working together with Democrats on. I've talked to some of your colleagues, both Republicans and Democrats, and almost everyone, when I pose that question, they immediately say veterans issues too. That's always on the top of their list.
Right. Right.
So just finally, let's say that I know that you've reintroduced it recently, but let's say the legislation is signed into law tomorrow. How long would it take before it's completely enacted and working the way that that you intend it to?
Well, I'm not sure the exact number of months it'll take. It'll take running the law through, of course, the Senate, as well as being signed by the president. I think he'd sign it. We will take that trip to the White House, as it were, in the not too distant future to see if we can get him on as our ally. But then it goes through the normal course of process. But I would hope that if we could pass it early on this term of office, that by the end of the term it would be functioning and in place, and the local law enforcement entities, as well as the FBI and others, the Justice Department will make it very clear that there's a new provision in town and you must follow it. At least we would hope that when we get into the next term, that citizens across the board will know that they'll be treated at least as good as common criminals. And that's something we haven't been able to say for quite a few years.